Lieutenant Nakamura crouched beside the boot prints in the red mud, his hand hovering over impressions that pointed southeast toward WWII, and felt the first cold finger of doubt trace down his spine. 12 sets of tracks, fresh as morning dew, leading directly into what should have been an ambush, except his men had found nothing but empty jungle and the mocking silence of invisible enemies. Subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. The rain had stopped 2 hours before dawn, leaving the jungle floor transformed into a vast canvas of clay that held secrets like wet paper held ink. Nakamura had been hunting Australian commandos through these mountains for 3 days, following trails that evaporated like smoke, pursuing sounds that died into nothing. But these prints were different, clear, defined, almost too perfect, as if someone had wanted them to be found. His tracker, a Korean conscript named Park, moved along the trail with the careful attention of a man reading text in a foreign language. He walked bent nearly double, his face sometimes only inches from the ground, studying each impression as though it might suddenly reveal its true nature. At 20 meters, he stopped. At 30, he dropped to his knees. At 40, he crawled backward, retracing his own steps to examine the marks again. Trudenon, Park said finally, his Japanese carrying the precise, overly careful pronunciation of someone speaking a language learned through fear and necessity. Something is wrong with these tracks. Nakamura stood, brushing a mosquito from his neck where it had begun to drill for blood. The jungle around them hummed with the thousand small sounds of morning. Birds whose names he didn't know, insects whose purpose seemed solely to devour human flesh, the distant rush of water over stones. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place where nothing was happening, where no ambush waited, where 12 Australian soldiers had apparently walked through and vanished like ghosts. Quote 2, he said, moving to stand beside Park, looking down at boot prints that seemed to him indistinguishable from any other boot prints he'd seen in 3 years of war. Park pressed his own boot into the mud beside one of the mysterious impressions, applying his full weight, then lifting it carefully to compare the two marks. The weight distribution is wrong, sir. When a man walks forward, his heel strikes first. Deeper impression at the back of the boot. But these... He gestured at the trail. The heel is too shallow. The toe is too deep, as if the men were walking on their toes, leaning backward. But that makes no sense. No one walks that way through jungle, not for any distance. Nakamura studied the prints more carefully now, seeing what Park meant. The impression did look odd, now that it had been pointed out. Like something that should make sense but didn't. Like a sentence with all the right words in the wrong order. Quote 5, he asked, though even as he said it the idea seemed absurd. Quote 6. Park stood, wiped red mud from his knees. Quote 7. He pointed to a low-hanging branch that crossed the trail at chest height. Quote 8. The cold finger of doubt became a hand, gripping Nakamura's chest. In 3 years of fighting in China, Manchuria, and now these godforsaken mountains, he'd learned that the jungle kept secrets. But he'd never imagined it could be made to lie so deliberately, so completely. He walked the trail himself now, seeing the inconsistencies everywhere once he knew to look for them. Places where the tracks led directly through obstacles that should have stopped or diverted a walking man. Places where the depth of the impression changed in ways that made no physical sense. It was as if someone had created the appearance of a trail while actually traveling somewhere else entirely, leaving behind evidence that looked right but felt wrong. How is this possible? He asked, more to himself than to Park. The Korean tracker shook his head slowly. I have tracked men through mountains in Korea, through forests in Manchuria. I have never seen anything like this. It is as if the ground itself is lying to us. 70 kilometers to the south, in a forward camp that existed on no official map, Sergeant Tommy Langford watched a barefoot man perform an act that defied every principle of human locomotion he'd learned in 32 years of life. The man moved forward across a patch of red mud, his body gliding smoothly as if on rails, while his footprints appeared to walk in the opposite direction. David Namatjira paused at the end of his demonstration, turned back to face the 6 commandos who'd been watching, with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright disbelief. He was a lean man, dark-skinned, with hands that looked like they'd been shaped by years of work that white Australians preferred not to think about. His English carried the careful precision of mission school education, each word selected and placed with deliberate care. Quote, 11, he said, his voice carrying no impatience, no frustration at having to repeat himself for the 3rd time that morning. Quote, 12. Private Jack Morrison, a clerk from Perth who'd spent 2 years in Syria, convinced he understood war, let out a short laugh that died the moment he saw Albert's face. The Aboriginal man's expression didn't change, didn't harden into anger or offense, but something in his eyes suggested he'd heard that particular laugh before, in 1,000 different contexts, and had long since stopped expecting anything else. Albert continued, as if the laugh had never happened. He demonstrated again, that strange gliding motion that made him look like a film played in reverse while running forward. Underscore quote, underscore 15, underscore. Morrison tried it, immediately lost his balance, windmilled his arms in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't so deadly serious. This is bloody ridiculous, he muttered, catching himself against a tree trunk. Captain James Herriot stepped into the small clearing they'd hacked from the kunai grass, his uniform dark with sweat despite the early hour. He'd been with Z Special Unit since its formation, had run operations in Timor and Borneo, and had survived this long by recognizing useful intelligence when he saw it, no matter how unlikely the source. This, Herriot said, his voice cutting through Morrison's complaint like a blade. Underscore quote, underscore, 18, underscore. He let the words settle into silence. Morrison's smirk faded like morning mist under sun. The other commandos shifted their weight, suddenly paying closer attention to the barefoot man who'd been speaking. Quote 19. Herriot continued, moving to stand beside Albert. Quote 20. Albert's brother had been sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, cleaning his rifle with movements so familiar they seemed like meditation. Now he looked up, his eyes moving from Morrison to the other commandos with an assessment that felt like being weighed and measured against some standard they didn't understand. Quote 21, he said, his English less polished than Albert's, carrying rhythms from a language where time moved differently, and the land itself was alive with meaning. The old people say the desert keeps secrets for those who know how to whisper to it. This jungle is louder, wetter. Everything grows and dies and grows again so fast you can almost hear it happening, but it still keeps secrets. He paused, his gaze settling on Morrison. If you learn its language. His name was David, and unlike Albert, who'd spent years at the Hermannsburg mission learning to read and write and speak the colonizer's tongue, David had grown up in the ranges, learning different texts written in stone and sand and the movements of stars. The rifle in his hands was new, but the knowledge in his head was older than the idea of Australia itself. Morrison opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. How long does it take to learn? This backward walking, I mean. Depends, Albert said, on whether you're trying to learn a trick or trying to understand why the trick works. A trick you can learn in a day. Understanding takes longer. He crouched down, traced patterns in the mud with his finger. When you walk normally, you're having a conversation with the ground. Your weight, your movement, they tell a story. Heel strike, roll forward, push off with the toe. That's the story of a man moving through space. Every tracker in the world knows that story, because it's the story of how humans walk. He drew another pattern beside the first. But what if you tell a different story? What if your weight distribution changes? Your foot placement becomes something that looks right, but feels wrong to someone who's tracking you. They see the prints. Their mind tries to read the story, but the story doesn't make sense. So they doubt themselves. They check again. They waste time. They make mistakes. David stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. My grandfather once tracked a wounded kangaroo for 2 days, followed it across sand, over rocks, through scrub so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But on the 3rd day, he came back empty-handed. said the kangaroo had learned to walk like a bird, hopping only on rocks, leaving no prints. He knew this was impossible, but he also knew what he'd seen, or rather, what he hadn't seen. The kangaroo understood that to survive, it had to become impossible. He looked at Morrison. You want to survive here? Learn to become impossible. The training began the next morning before dawn, when the jungle was still wrapped in mist and the temperature hadn't yet climbed to the brutal heat that would make every movement feel like wading through hot soup. Albert had Morrison and two others, a farm boy from Queensland named Stevens and a former bank teller from Adelaide called Wright, practicing the reverse step on a 50-meter stretch of trail that he'd marked with broken twigs. Morrison fell 4 times in the first hour. His boots, designed for European battlefields where the ground stayed relatively solid, seemed to actively resist the technique. Every time he tried to shift his weight in the unnatural pattern Albert demonstrated, the mud grabbed at his soul like a living thing, pulling him off balance. The problem, Albert said, watching Morrison's 5th attempt with the patient attention of someone who'd taught children to track before they could properly speak, is you're fighting the ground. You think it's your enemy because it's trying to keep you here, trying to hold your boot. So you pull harder, push harder, trying to force your way through. He crouched beside Morrison's latest footprint, which had sunk nearly 10 centimeters into the red clay. Stevens, who'd been watching while catching his breath, spoke up. So how do we not fight it? Albert stood, brushed mud from his hands. You ask permission. You move like the ground is your elder, something you respect. You distribute your weight across the whole foot at once instead of rolling from heel to toe. Like this. He demonstrated again, his bare foot settling onto the mud surface with such even pressure that the impression was barely deeper than a thumb's width. Quote 36. David appeared from the tree line, carrying a helmet filled with dark, almost black mud from somewhere deeper in the jungle. He set it down beside the practice trail without explanation, then sat back on his haunches and watched the 3 soldiers attempt what his people had been doing for longer than anyone could count. Wright managed it first, something clicking in his understanding after watching Albert's demonstration for the 20th time. His boot sank into the mud differently, still left a print, but a shallow one, the kind that the next rain would blur into nothing. He took 3 more steps, maintaining the technique, then stumbled and nearly fell. There, Albert said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. You felt it, didn't you? That moment when the ground accepted your weight instead of resisting it. Wright nodded, breathing hard despite having only walked a few meters. The concentration required was exhausting in a way that normal marching never was. Every muscle in his legs burned from the unnatural movement pattern. Now do it backward, David said, speaking for the first time that morning. Morrison stared at him. We haven't even mastered doing it forward yet. Forward is just practice, David replied. Backward is the weapon. Forward-backward is what makes you invisible. He stood, moved to the trail, and demonstrated something that made Morrison's head hurt to watch. David's body moved forward along the path, but his feet performed that strange reverse stepping pattern so that his tracks appeared to show a man walking in the opposite direction. This is what Lieutenant Nakamura found yesterday. This is what his tracker, Park, couldn't explain. Prints that point southeast, but were made by a man moving northwest. Albert took over the explanation. We'd been teaching you the components separately. The mud walk, how to step lightly. The reverse step, how to make tracks that point backward while moving forward. But in real use, you combine them. You move forward using the reverse step pattern, but you also apply the mud walk weight distribution. The result is prints that are both misleading in direction and faint enough that they'll disappear quickly. He paused, watching their faces to see if they understood. And then you add variation. You don't do it for every step. You do it for 50 meters, then walk normally for 20, then do it again for 100. You cross streams. You walk on logs. You step on rocks. You create a trail so confusing that even when a tracker figures out one deception, they can't trust anything else they're seeing. Stevens wiped sweat from his forehead. How long did it take you to learn all this? Albert and David exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. We didn't learn it, Albert said finally. We inherited it. My grandfather taught my father. My father taught me. David and I have been reading tracks since before we could read words. But the principles, those can be taught. You just have to be willing to think differently about what the ground is. Morrison tried the combined technique, managed 3 steps before his coordination failed completely, and he sat down hard in the mud. This is impossible, he said, but there was less complaint in his voice now, more determination. Good, David said, offering him a hand up. Impossible is exactly what you need to be. By midday, all 3 soldiers could perform the basic reverse step for at least 20 paces before losing the rhythm. It wasn't good enough for actual field use, not yet, but it was a foundation. Albert called a break, and they sat in the shade of a massive tree whose roots created natural seats. Captain Harriet appeared through the jungle, moving with the careful stealth of someone who'd learned not to announce himself. He watched the 3 exhausted commandos for a moment, then turned to Albert. How are they doing? They're learning to listen, Albert replied. Whether they're learning to hear is a different question. That takes longer. He paused. We need more time with them. A week, maybe 2, before they can use this under pressure. Harriet's face tightened. Quote 5-6. The words hung in the humid air like a sentence already passed. Morrison looked at his hands, covered in mud and small cuts from jungle thorns, and wondered if 4 days would be enough time to learn how to lie to the ground. Or if the ground would betray him to Japanese trackers who'd learned their own ancient languages of pursuit and evasion. The 4 days became an immersion so complete that Morrison later couldn't remember sleeping, though he must have. Albert and David drove them through variations of the technique until muscle memory began to override conscious thought. They practiced in daylight and darkness, in rain and brief intervals of sun that turned the jungle into a steam bath. They learned to step backward while moving forward, to distribute weight like water instead of stone, to read the mud's texture and adjust their gait accordingly. But the brothers taught more than just footwork. On the second day, David led them to a stream that cut through the jungle floor like a brown artery, swollen with runoff from the mountains. He waded in without hesitation, the water rising to his knees, and gestured for them to follow. Water is your friend, he said, moving upstream with steps that barely disturbed the current. Tracks disappear in water. Scent disappears in water. You become nothing in water. He stopped, turned to face them. But you have to understand which water to use. Fast water, like this, erases everything quickly. Slow water, stagnant water, it holds smells. Dogs can track you through stagnant water sometimes. And you have to know which direction to move. Upstream, you work harder, but you're moving against the flow. Harder for someone to predict where you'll exit. Downstream is easier, but more obvious. Stevens, who'd grown up on a property outside Rockhampton, spoke up. David smiled for the first time since they'd met him. Crocodiles are less dangerous than Japanese machine guns, and they mostly stay in the bigger rivers, not these little veins. Mostly. The smile faded. But yes, you watch for them. You watch for everything. That's the point. In the desert, my people survive by paying attention to every detail. Every scratch on a rock. Every bent grass blade. Every shift in the wind. Here it's the same, just wetter. You're not learning tricks. You're learning to see. Albert appeared on the opposite bank, having circled around while David kept them occupied. Come out here, he called, but don't walk straight across. Use the rocks. Step on them, not between them. The commandos picked their way across, boots slipping on moss-covered stones. When they reached Albert, he pointed back at the stream. Look at what you left behind. They turned. The water had already erased any sign of their passage through it, but where they'd climbed out on the far bank, their boots had left clear prints in the mud. Quote 66. Albert said quietly. Quote 67. He crouched, showed them how to exit water onto rocks rather than mud, or, failing that, how to step backward out of the water so the prince suggested entry rather than exit. Every technique had a counter-technique, every deception a layer deeper. Wright asked the question that had been bothering Morrison. Quote 68. Quote 69, Albert said simply. Quote 70. David added something in his own language, rapid and musical, then translated. Quote 71. He paused. Quote 72. On the third day, they practiced scent masking. David had found a stand of wild ginger growing in a wet ravine, and he showed them how to crush the rhizomes and rub the juice on their skin and clothes. The smell was sharp, almost medicinal, but it blended with the jungle's natural odor in a way that tobacco smoke or soap never would. Dogs track by scent first, sight second, Albert explained. If you smell like the jungle, you're halfway to invisible. But it has to be plants from here, from this specific area. You can't use something that doesn't belong because that's what stands out. Everything you do has to be about becoming part of the pattern, not breaking it. They also learned what Albert called weather reading, understanding when to move and when to stay still based on conditions. Just after rain, the ground is softest, holds prints longest, he told them. You wait if you can. Wait for the sun to come out. Wait for the surface to crust over a bit. Your prints will be less distinct, will erode faster. And you watch the sky constantly. Rain coming means you can move more boldly because the rain will erase your tracks. Rain stopping means you get careful again. Morrison found himself looking at the jungle differently. What had been an undifferentiated mass of green hostility became a text he was beginning to read. He noticed which plants grew near water, which animals moved at which times of day, how the light changed as the sun tracked across the sky. It was like learning a language where every word mattered and mistakes could be measured in lives. On the fourth morning, Captain Harriet assembled them before dawn. 6 commandos now, including Morrison, Wright, and Stevens, plus 3 others who'd joined the crash training. Albert and David stood to one side, faces unreadable in the pre-dawn darkness. Quote, 77, Harriet said without preamble. Quote, 78, he gestured to the brothers. Quote, 79. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. 5 days in Japanese-controlled territory, using techniques they'd barely mastered, with the knowledge that enemy trackers were actively hunting for Australian patrols. He looked at Albert, trying to read the man's expression, but found nothing there except calm attention. Quote 80, Harriet continued. He paused. No one spoke. What question could capture the complexity of what they were about to attempt, walking into enemy territory, armed with knowledge that was 4 days old, trying to disappear in a landscape that wanted to reveal them, hunted by men who'd spent lifetimes learning to find the invisible? Albert simply nodded once, picked up his pack, and started walking north into the jungle that was just beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. The 6 commandos followed, their boots making sounds that seemed impossibly loud despite everything they'd learned, leaving prints that Albert would later show them how to read, prints that told stories about fear and inexperience, and the desperate hope that ancient knowledge transplanted to new ground might be enough to keep them breathing. They moved north through terrain that seemed designed to betray human presence. The jungle floor alternated between ankle-deep mud and exposed roots that rang like drums when stepped on carelessly. Albert led them not in a straight line, but in a deliberate pattern of curves and switchbacks, using fallen logs as bridges, stepping on rocks that protruded from the muck, occasionally doubling back on their own trail using the reverse step technique to create the illusion of a patrol that had advanced and then retreated. Morrison watched Albert's feet obsessively, trying to memorize the rhythm. The Aboriginal scout moved like he was part of the jungle's own circulation, his steps finding solid ground that Morrison couldn't distinguish from the sucking mud that surrounded it. When Albert did leave tracks, they were shallow and ambiguous, prints that could have been made an hour ago or a day ago, by a man or possibly by something else entirely. After 2 hours, Albert called a halt in a small depression surrounded by dense vegetation. He gathered the 6 men close, speaking in a whisper that barely carried above the constant drip of water from leaves overhead. "We crossed a Japanese patrol route 40 meters back," he said. "You didn't see it because it doesn't look like what you think a trail looks like. No cleared path, no obvious markings. Just a line of least resistance through the undergrowth that shows slight compression, slightly fewer spider webs than the areas around it. They use that route regularly, maybe every 2 days. It runs east-west, probably connecting positions at Mubo with their supply lines to the coast." Wright, who'd been trained as a scout before joining Z Special Unit, looked embarrassed. Albert replied without judgment. He sketched in the dirt with a stick, showing them the route he'd identified. "We need to cross it again on our way back, but we'll do it differently. Going north, we stepped over it using a log. Coming south, we'll wade through the creek that parallels it, then exit onto rocks. Create 2 different stories about who we are and where we're going." Stevens shifted his pack, trying to find a position where the straps didn't dig into shoulders already raw from 3 days of practice and now this. Quote 89. Albert was quiet for a moment, and Morrison saw something flicker across his face that might have been amusement or might have been something more complicated. Quote 90. He stood, slinging his rifle across his back. Quote 91. He gestured at the mud surrounding them. Quote 92. They moved on, climbing gradually toward higher ground. The jungle thinned slightly as they gained elevation, the massive trees giving way to more scattered growth with dense undergrowth between. Albert slowed their pace even further, using hand signals more than words now. Morrison's legs burned from the unnatural walking patterns they'd been practicing. The reverse step required muscles he didn't normally use, and maintaining the light-footed mud walk for hours at a time was exhausting in ways that normal marching never had been. But he could see the results. When he looked back at their trail, which Albert made them do every 30 minutes, teaching them to see what a tracker would see, the footprints were sparse and shallow, often disappearing entirely where they'd used rocks or logs. On the afternoon of the first day, they heard voices. Japanese voices, carrying through the jungle with the particular quality of men who thought they were alone. Albert dropped to a crouch so smoothly, it seemed like he'd simply melted into the vegetation. The commandos followed his lead, freezing in place. The voices grew closer. Morrison could make out individual words now, though his Japanese was limited to a few phrases learned from intelligence briefings. The patrol sounded relaxed, talking among themselves with the casual rhythm of soldiers performing routine duty. They passed within 30 meters of the hidden Australians, 8 men moving in single file along what must have been another of those invisible trails that Albert could read, but Morrison couldn't. When the voices faded, Albert didn't move for another 10 minutes. Finally, he rose and led them not away from the Japanese route, but parallel to it, shadowing the enemy patrol from a distance that let them hear occasional sounds, but not see the men making them. Wright leaned close to Morrison, barely breathing the words. "Why are we following them?" Morrison didn't know, but he watched Albert's movements and understood that this was part of the education. They were learning to think like hunters and hunted simultaneously. To understand that sometimes the safest place was close to danger because that's the last place anyone expected you to be. After an hour of this parallel tracking, Albert led them sharply east, away from the Japanese route, and up a steep slope covered in loose stones that shifted underfoot. It was treacherous climbing, the kind that would normally leave obvious signs of passage. But Albert showed them how to place their feet on the uphill side of rocks so the stones didn't roll, how to use exposed roots as handholds without stripping bark, how to move through difficult terrain while leaving it looking undisturbed. They reached a ridge as the light began to fail, and Albert selected a position in a small cave formed by fallen boulders. "We don't use fires," he said, though no one had suggested it. "We eat cold rations, we don't smoke, we take turns on watch in 2-hour shifts, and we don't talk. Sound carries at night in ways you don't expect." Morrison took the first watch with Albert, sitting in the darkness while the jungle transformed around them. Nightbirds called. Insects created symphonies of sound that made it hard to hear anything else. And somewhere out there, Japanese patrols were moving through the same darkness, possibly looking for the Australian team, possibly unaware they existed. "Tomorrow," Albert whispered, so quietly Morrison had to lean close to hear. We reach the area we need to observe. That's when it gets dangerous. Not the travel, but the staying still. Making yourself invisible while you're not moving is harder than making yourself invisible while you move. Because you can't control everything around you. A bird might land on a branch near your head and then fly away suddenly, and anyone watching will wonder what startled it. He paused, and Morrison could feel rather than see him looking out into the darkness. My grandfather taught me that the hardest hunt is hunting yourself, learning to be so still that your own body forgets you're waiting. That's what we have to do starting tomorrow. Hunt ourselves into invisibility while we watch the enemy hunt for us. The observation position Albert selected on the second day was a ledge hidden behind a curtain of vines, overlooking a valley where Japanese positions sprawled across the hillside like a diagram from an intelligence manual. From here, they could see supply routes, count troops during shift changes, identify weapon emplacements and ammunition stores. It was perfect for reconnaissance. It was also, Morrison realized with growing unease, a trap if they were discovered. Albert seemed to read his thoughts. The best hiding place is always the one that's hardest to escape from, he said, his voice barely audible, even though Morrison was crouched beside him. Because that's the place no one expects you to be. They search the easy positions first, the ones where you could run if discovered. This, he gestured at the sheer drop below them and the dense jungle behind. This is what my people call a lizard hole. You go in, you stay absolutely still, and you trust that no one will look where looking seems impossible. They settled into the position, 6 men arranging themselves in the minimal space with the careful choreography of people who understood that a careless movement could dislodge a stone and send it clattering down to the valley below. Wright unpacked the radio, its components wrapped in oilcloth to protect against the constant moisture. Stevens produced a waterproof notebook and began sketching the enemy positions with the precise hand of someone who'd worked as a draftsman before the war. The hours compressed into a timeless vigil. They watched Japanese soldiers move through routines that seemed almost peaceful from this distance. Men washing clothes in a stream, playing cards outside a bunker, smoking cigarettes in the brief intervals between duties. Morrison found himself thinking about the strangeness of war, how you could watch men live their ordinary lives while planning how to destroy them. On the third day of observation, a Japanese patrol came up the slope directly below their position. Albert's hand moved in a signal that meant absolute stillness, and Morrison felt his heart hammering against his ribs as boots crunched through undergrowth less than 20 meters away. The patrol was searching, moving slowly, examining the ground with the kind of attention that suggested they knew someone was in the area, even if they couldn't pinpoint exactly where. One soldier stopped almost directly beneath the ledge. He was young, Morrison could see that even from above, with a face that could have belonged to someone's younger brother. The soldier looked up, his gaze sweeping across the cliff face, and for a terrible moment Morrison was certain they'd been spotted. But the man's eyes passed over the vine curtain without pausing, seeing what he expected to see, rock and vegetation, nothing more. The patrol moved on after 30 minutes that felt like 30 hours. When they were finally out of earshot, Albert made another hand signal, and the team relaxed fractionally, though no one moved from their positions. Later, when darkness made observation impossible and they could risk quiet conversation, Albert gathered them close. "That patrol was looking for us specifically," he whispered, "not just general searching. They found our trail somewhere, or they've been told to expect Australian scouts in this area. The way they moved, the way they looked, that was a hunter's search, not a soldier's patrol." Wright's face was pale in the darkness. "Quote 104. Quote 105, Albert replied. Quote 106. Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Quote 107. Quote 108. Albert shifted position slightly, easing cramped muscles. Quote 109. The next morning brought rain, heavy drops that turned the jungle into a drumming gray world where visibility shrank to a few meters. Albert used the weather, moving them between positions with the confidence of someone who understood that rain was an ally. The sound covered their movements, the water blurred their tracks, and anyone searching for them would be as blind as they were. At the second observation point, tucked behind a fallen log that had created a natural blind, Stevens spotted something that made him grab Morrison's arm. A Japanese officer was standing at the edge of the enemy camp, and beside him was a man in different uniform, Korean, Morrison guessed from intelligence briefings, who was examining the ground with intense concentration. Through binoculars, Morrison watched the Korean tracker work. The man moved like Albert moved, with that same careful attention to details invisible to normal observation. He was studying an area of disturbed earth, probably where the Japanese patrol had searched the previous day, and his body language suggested he'd found something interesting. Albert watched through his own binoculars for several minutes, then lowered them with an expression Morrison couldn't read. "That's Park," he said quietly. "I've heard about him. Korean conscript, grew up hunting in mountains near the border with Manchuria. The Japanese use him because he's better than any of their own trackers." He paused. "He just found where we crossed their patrol route on the first day. He's reading our trail backward, figuring out not just that we were there, but how we moved, what techniques we used." "Can he track us here?" Wright asked, his voice tight. "Not yet. The rain yesterday erased too much. But he's learning our pattern, same way we're learning theirs. He'll be looking for us now with knowledge of how we think." Albert lowered his binoculars. "This changes things. We can't just hide anymore. We need to actively mislead him, leave false trails that make him doubt what he's seeing." Morrison understood what Albert wasn't saying directly, that they'd moved beyond simply practicing counter-tracking techniques and entered into a direct contest with someone who possessed similar skills, but perhaps more experience. The thought was terrifying and oddly exhilarating at the same time, like realizing you were playing chess against a master when you'd only just learned how the pieces moved. That night, instead of staying at their observation positions, Albert led them on what he called a false trail operation. They moved deliberately through an area east of their actual route, using normal walking patterns, leaving clear tracks, making it look like a careless patrol. Then they backtracked, using the reverse step technique, walked through a creek for half a kilometer, and climbed onto a ridge of exposed rock that would hold no prints. Albert said as they settled into a new hide position far from where Park would find their false trail, but Morrison, lying in the darkness, listening to rain start again, wondered if they were creating doubt or just postponing the inevitable moment when Park's experience would outmatch their hastily learned techniques. And he wondered what happened when two trackers, one from the Australian desert and one from Korean mountains, met in New Guinea jungle through the medium of footprints and disturbed earth, each trying to read the other's mind through the text of broken ground. On the fifth day of the patrol, Morrison woke to find Albert gone from the hide position. The other commandos were still sleeping in the gray pre-dawn light, and for a moment Morrison felt a spike of panic before he spotted movement on the ridge above, Albert returning with the careful silence of someone who'd been scouting while others slept. Albert slid into the position and gathered the team with urgent hand signals. When they were all awake and attentive, he spoke in a whisper that barely qualified as sound. "Park found our false trail yesterday, just as we planned. But he didn't follow it. He studied it for maybe 20 minutes, then turned around and started working backward along our real route, the one we thought the rain had erased." Wright's face showed incomprehension. Albert interrupted. Stevens swore quietly. Morrison felt his stomach tighten with the realization that they were being hunted by someone who understood the same principles they'd just learned, but had been applying them for longer, with more refinement. "Where is he now?" Morrison asked. "2 ridges south, working his way north with a patrol of 8 men, moving slowly, carefully, checking everything. At his current pace, he'll reach this position by tomorrow afternoon." Albert's voice remained calm, but his eyes held something Morrison had learned to recognize as the sharp focus of a man calculating odds. "Quote 124. Quote 125, Wright asked. Quote 126. Albert let the words hang in the humid air. Quote 127. The idea was audacious enough to seem insane, but Morrison found himself understanding the logic. If Park was learning their patterns by reading their tracks, then they needed to learn his patterns by watching him work. It was turning the hunt inside out, making the prey into observers of the predator. Captain Harriet would never approve such a deviation from mission parameters, but Harriet was 3 days away at base camp, and Albert was here, making decisions based on immediate tactical reality. Morrison saw the other commandos looking at each other, saw the same calculation happening behind their eyes. Trust the Aboriginal scout whose methods had kept them alive so far, or stick to conventional military doctrine that Park probably understood better than they did. Quote 128, Morrison heard himself say. Quote 129, the others nodded agreement. Albert's expression didn't change, but Morrison caught something in his eyes that might have been approval, or might have been the recognition that they were finally starting to think like trackers rather than soldiers. They broke camp with meticulous care, erasing every sign of their presence. Albert showed them techniques they hadn't learned in the crash training course, how to restore compressed vegetation to its natural state, how to scatter leaf litter in patterns that looked undisturbed, how to check their position from multiple angles to see what a tracker approaching from different directions would see. Then they moved south, not along the ridge where Park would expect retreat, but down into the valley, and then up the opposite slope, circling behind where Albert estimated the Korean trackers' patrol would be. It took 6 hours of careful movement, using every technique they'd learned, plus new variations Albert introduced on the fly. They found Park's patrol in late afternoon, settled into an observation position on a small rise that overlooked the route the enemy was taking. From here, Morrison could watch through binoculars as Park worked, and what he saw was both fascinating and terrifying. Park moved across ground like he was reading Braille, his fingers sometimes literally touching the earth as he examined prints and disturbances. He would spend 5 minutes studying a single footprint, testing the mud's consistency, checking how water had pooled in the depression, examining the pattern of displacement around the edges. Then he would stand, look at the surrounding terrain, and make small gestures to his patrol that adjusted their search pattern. Albert watched with the focused intensity of a student observing a master. "He's not just tracking," Albert whispered to Morrison. "He's having a conversation with whoever made the tracks, asking questions. How heavy are you? How tired? How experienced? Are you military or civilian? How long have you been in this jungle?" Every track answers some of those questions, if you know how to read it. Morrison watched Park crouch beside what must have been one of their tracks from 3 days ago, mostly erased by rain, but apparently still visible to expert eyes. The Korean tracker's face showed concentration so intense it was almost meditative. He was, Morrison realized, doing exactly what Albert did, reading the ground as a text that told stories. Quote 132, Albert breathed, pointing. Quote 133. Park suddenly stood and turned, looking directly at the ridge where they were hidden. Morrison's breath caught. The distance was too great for Park to see them through the vegetation, but the Korean tracker's body language suggested he sensed something, some disturbance in the pattern that his instincts had flagged. For 30 seconds that stretched like hours, Park stared at their position. Then he spoke to the Japanese officer beside him, pointing not at where they actually were, but at a ridge 50 meters to the east. The officer nodded, and the patrol adjusted course toward the false location. Albert exhaled slowly. Quote 134. He paused. Quote 135. They withdrew as carefully as they'd approached, leaving the hide position exactly as they'd found it. As they moved back north toward their original observation area, Morrison found himself thinking about the strange duel they were engaged in. 2 traditions of tracking and counter-tracking, one from Australian desert and one from Korean mountains, meeting in New Guinea jungle through the medium of disturbed earth and broken vegetation. That night, sheltered in a cave that Albert had scouted days earlier as an emergency position, the team reviewed what they'd learned about Park's methods. Albert drew diagrams in the dirt, explaining what he'd observed, translating Park's techniques into principles they could counter. Albert said, and the admission carried no shame, just factual assessment. Quote, 137 Morrison wanted to believe this, wanted to trust that their crash education could match Park's lifetime of experience. But watching the Korean tracker work had shown him the vast distance between competence and mastery, and he wasn't sure 4 days of training could bridge that gap, even with Albert's teaching. The question none of them asked, but all of them thought was simple. When Park finally caught up to their position, would their tricks be enough to stay invisible, or would they discover that some hunters were simply too skilled to evade? The extraction was scheduled for the 7th day, a submarine pickup at a beach coordinates they'd memorized before departure. But reaching that beach meant crossing 15 kilometers of terrain that Park's patrol now actively controlled, moving through an area where the Korean tracker had learned their patterns and would be anticipating their route. Albert proposed something that made even Morrison, who'd learned to trust the Aboriginal scouts' judgment, question whether they'd crossed from calculated risk into suicidal desperation. They would split into 2 groups, create diverging trails, and whoever Park didn't follow would make the extraction, while the other group led the enemy away and found an alternate escape route overland. It's the only way, Albert insisted when Wright argued against dividing their already small force. Park can't track 2 trails simultaneously with 1 patrol. He'll have to choose, and whichever group he doesn't choose gets through. The other group will have to improvise. The unspoken question was who would be bait and who would escape. Albert settled it by volunteering himself, Morrison, and Stevens for the decoy trail. Wright and the other 3 would make for the beach extraction. Morrison understood the logic. Albert's tracking skills gave the decoy group the best chance of evading pursuit long enough for the others to escape. But it still felt like being handed a death sentence wrapped in tactical necessity. They split just before dawn on the 6th day, each group moving in opposite directions from a creek that would confuse the initial tracking. Wright's group headed east toward the coast, moving with all the counter-tracking techniques they'd learned. Albert led Morrison and Stevens northwest, deeper into Japanese-controlled territory, leaving a trail that was careful enough to seem like men trying to hide, but flawed enough to give Park something to follow. Quote, Albert explained as they moved through a stretch of mud that would hold prints clearly. Quote, Morrison walked behind Albert, watching the Aboriginal scout deliberately make small mistakes. A footprint slightly deeper than necessary here. A broken branch there. Tiny breadcrumbs of evidence that would keep Park engaged without making him suspicious that the trail was false. It was tracking as performance art, creating a narrative convincing enough to hold an expert's attention. They led Park's patrol on a winding route through some of the most difficult terrain Morrison had encountered, across ridges where loose shale made every step treacherous, through ravines thick with wait-a-while vines that tore at clothes and skin. Albert set a pace that was punishing but sustainable, always staying just far enough ahead that Park would need to keep pushing to maintain contact. On the afternoon of the 6th day, they watched from concealment as Park's patrol struggled up a slope they'd crossed 2 hours earlier. The Korean tracker was showing signs of fatigue now, his movements less fluid than they'd been, and Morrison felt a vicious satisfaction at seeing the man who'd haunted their patrol reduced to the same exhausted slog they'd been enduring. But Park was still reading their trail, still making the small, intuitive leaps that kept him on their track despite Albert's increasingly sophisticated deceptions. Morrison watched through binoculars as Park examined a section where they'd used the reverse step technique, saw the tracker's face show first confusion, then comprehension, then what looked like grudging respect. Stevens whispered. Albert nodded, his expression thoughtful. That night they didn't sleep. Instead, they spent the dark hours creating the most elaborate false trail Albert could devise, a route that appeared to lead toward the coast but actually curved back inland, with carefully staged evidence suggesting 3 men becoming careless with fatigue, making mistakes, leaving clearer tracks. They even scattered some of their rations along the trail, as if dropped accidentally, selling the story of exhausted soldiers losing discipline. Then they doubled back using a creek bed, walked for 2 kilometers in ankle-deep water, and climbed onto a ridge of volcanic rock that would hold no tracks whatsoever. From there, they moved west, perpendicular to every direction Park would logically expect, using techniques Albert had held in reserve. Walking on logs for extended distances, using vines to move through the canopy where possible. At one point, actually climbing backward down a cliff face so their hand and footholds would suggest ascent rather than descent. By dawn of the 7th day, they were 15 kilometers from where Park would be following their false trail, hidden in a cave system Albert had somehow known existed, despite never having been in this specific area before. When Morrison asked how he'd found it, Albert just said, quote, 145. They radioed base camp using Wright's agreed-upon code phrases, learned that the extraction had been successful, that all 3 men had made it to the submarine pickup without incident. The relief Morrison felt was physical, a loosening of tension he hadn't fully realised he'd been carrying. But their own situation remained precarious. They were deep in Japanese territory, cut off from easy extraction routes, and while they'd temporarily lost Park, the Korean tracker would eventually realise the trail he was following was false, and begin the painstaking work of backtracking to find where they'd diverged. "How long do we have?" Morrison asked. Albert considered this, his eyes distant with calculation. "Park is good, but that false trail was my best work. He'll follow it for at least another day before he realizes. Then maybe half a day to backtrack and find our divergence point at the creek. Then he has to figure out which direction we actually went, and we left no clear signs. 3 days total if we're lucky, 2 if we're not." Stevens was checking their supplies, his face grim. "We have rations for maybe 5 more days if we're careful. After that, we're foraging." "Won't need 5 days," Albert said. "There's an Australian position at WWII, about 30 kilometers west of here. If we move carefully, we can reach it in 4 days, maybe less if we push hard." He paused, and Morrison saw something shift in his expression. "But there's another option, something riskier but faster." Morrison almost didn't want to ask, but training and exhaustion had eroded his capacity for self-preservation. Albert said quietly, "It was insane. It was also exactly the kind of thing that Park wouldn't anticipate, because no rational commander would attempt it." Morrison looked at Stevens, saw his own mix of terror and desperate calculation reflected back. "If we try to go around," Stevens said slowly, "Park might catch us before we make it. If we go through, we might walk straight into a Japanese patrol and get killed immediately. Either way, we're gambling." "Everything's gambling," Albert replied. "Question is, which bet has better odds? And I think Park expects us to run away from danger, not toward it. That's European military thinking. Avoid enemy concentrations, seek safety. But my people survived by sometimes doing the opposite, by hiding in the places predators didn't think to look because they seemed too dangerous." Morrison thought about Lieutenant Nakamura finding those impossible footprints, about Park reading their trail like a book written in mud, about all the times in this war when conventional tactics had failed because the enemy had learned to anticipate them. And he thought about Albert's grandfather tracking that wounded kangaroo for 2 days before the animal learned to walk like a bird, becoming impossible, surviving through transformation. Quote 159, Morrison heard himself say, committing them to a path that would either prove Albert's teaching or prove that some gambles were simply too bold to survive. They approached the Japanese supply route in late afternoon when the light was failing and visibility dropped to shadows and shapes rather than clear details. Albert had spent 2 hours observing the traffic pattern from a concealed position, counting the intervals between patrols, noting the shift changes, identifying the moments when attention would be most fragmented. "Supply carriers come through every 40 minutes, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the jungle sounds. Mixed groups, Japanese soldiers, local conscripts, sometimes Korean labor units. They move in files of 20 to 30 people, strung out over 100 meters because the trail is narrow. The guards are at front and back, watching for ambush from the sides. They don't expect infiltration from within the column itself." Morrison studied the route through binoculars, watching a column pass with the shuffling exhaustion of men who'd been carrying heavy loads through difficult terrain for hours. Most wore the faded uniforms and vacant expressions of people performing pure labor, disconnected from the larger context of war. A few guards with rifles maintained discipline, but their attention was outward, scanning the jungle for threats. __quote _162 _____. Albert continued. Stevens looked doubtful. Albert's eyes held that calculation Morrison had learned to recognize as the moment before commitment. The key is confidence. If you move like you belong, most people won't question it. They see what they expect to see. They waited for the next column, watching it approach with the painful slowness of tired men carrying supplies that seemed designed to break human backs. When the middle of the column passed their position, Albert simply stood up and walked out of the jungle onto the trail, Morrison and Stevens following with their hearts hammering against their ribs. No one shouted. No alarm was raised. They fell into step with a group of men who barely glanced at them, too focused on their own misery to care about 3 additional bodies in the shuffle. Morrison kept his head down, his rifle positioned to partially obscure his face, moving with the shuffling gait of exhaustion that required no acting whatsoever. The trail wound through jungle that was darkening rapidly as night approached. Morrison could hear Japanese being spoken somewhere ahead, guards calling out something that might have been encouragement or threats, impossible to distinguish. His skin crawled with the certainty that at any moment someone would notice, would see through the deception, would raise an alarm that would end with bullets and probably death. But the moment didn't come. They walked for what Morrison's terrified perception stretched into hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, moving through the heart of Japanese-controlled territory disguised as nothing more than additional laborers, in a system too large and disorganized to track every individual body. It was invisibility through overwhelming presence, hiding in plain sight by becoming part of the pattern rather than breaking it. When they reached the creek crossing, Albert didn't hesitate. He simply stepped sideways off the trail as the column continued forward, moving into the water as naturally as if he'd been sent to fill canteens. Morrison and Stevens followed, wading into the current that was waist-deep and fast enough to require effort to maintain footing. They moved downstream, using the water to erase their scent and tracks, for 200 meters before climbing out onto rocks that would hold no prints. Behind them, the column continued north, probably still unaware that it had briefly contained 3 Australian commandos moving in the opposite direction. That, Stevens said when they were finally hidden in vegetation far enough from the trail to risk speaking, was the most insane thing I've ever done. Albert allowed himself a small smile. My grandfather used to raid neighboring clans' hunting grounds by walking through their camps at night. Said the best time to steal from someone is when they're looking right at you, because that's when they're most convinced you're not a threat. They moved west now, making better time through terrain that was less actively patrolled. The gambit had worked. They'd crossed the most dangerous section of their route in under an hour, putting them significantly ahead of any schedule Park might be calculating. But Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they'd used up whatever luck or divine protection had been keeping them alive, that the next impossible thing they attempted would be the one that finally failed. On the 8th day, they spotted smoke from Australian positions at WWII, thin columns rising above the jungle canopy like prayers made visible. They were close enough now that Morrison could taste the promise of safety, close enough that his mind was already relaxing its vigilance, already celebrating survival. Which was when they found Park's patrol waiting for them. The Korean tracker had done something Morrison would have thought impossible. He'd somehow anticipated their route, moved ahead of them instead of behind, and positioned his 8-man patrol across the exact ridge they needed to traverse to reach WWII. Morrison spotted them from 300 meters away, saw Park standing at the center of his men with binoculars, methodically scanning the jungle in a pattern that would eventually cover every approach. Albert pulled them back into cover, his face showing the first real concern Morrison had seen since the patrol began. Albert said quietly, "Quote 171. Stevens checked his rifle, a gesture Morrison recognized as psychological preparation for the violence that might be coming. Quote 172. Quote 173. Morrison understood what Albert wasn't saying, that Park had learned from studying their techniques, had adapted his own methods, and was now applying a counter-strategy that neutralized their advantages. The student had taught the master something about how the student thought, and the master had used that knowledge to set a trap. "What do we do?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be another impossible thing, another gambit that required faith in principles he'd only just begun to understand. Albert studied the ridge for long minutes, his eyes moving across terrain with that reading text intensity Morrison had learned to recognize. Finally, he spoke, and his words carried the weight of a decision that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few hours. Albert said, quote, 176. Morrison looked at Albert's expression and saw something there that terrified him more than Park's ambush. Absolute certainty, the kind of conviction that came from knowledge so deep it had become faith. And he realized that after 8 days of learning to lie with footprints and hide in impossible places, they were about to attempt something that would either validate everything Albert had taught them or prove that some ancient knowledge, however powerful, couldn't survive translation to modern war. The death walk, as Albert explained it in whispers that barely disturbed the air, was less a technique than a meditation made physical. It required moving so slowly that individual steps took minutes to complete, distributing weight so precisely that the foot made contact with earth without compression, without displacement, leaving behind nothing that resembled a human track. His grandfather had used it to pass through sacred grounds during initiation ceremonies, moving across sand that would show a lizard's passage, but remained unmarked by human feet. Quote, 177, Albert said, demonstrating with movements so gradual, Morrison could barely perceive them happening. Quote, 178. They began 2 hours before sunset, when the light was changing and Park's patrol would be dealing with the visual confusion of lengthening shadows. Albert led them on an approach that brought them within 50 meters of the Japanese position, close enough that Morrison could hear individual voices, could smell tobacco smoke from cigarettes being shared among bored soldiers who'd been sitting in ambush positions all day. The death walk transformed time into something viscous and strange. Each step required Morrison to find a placement where his boot would contact multiple small points simultaneously, a root here, a stone there, distributed pressure that never concentrated enough to leave an impression. His muscles screamed from holding positions that human bodies weren't designed to maintain. Sweat ran into his eyes, but he couldn't move quickly enough to wipe it away without breaking the rhythm that Albert had established. They passed within 20 meters of a Japanese sentry who was looking directly toward them, his eyes scanning the jungle with the glazed attention of someone performing a task that had become mechanical through repetition. Morrison froze mid-step, his foot suspended in air for what felt like hours, but was probably only 90 seconds, while the sentry's gaze swept across the exact space his body occupied. The man saw trees, saw shadows, saw the jungle's natural chaos, but he didn't see 3 Australian soldiers becoming part of that chaos through movement so slow it registered as stillness. Park himself stood at the ridge's highest point, his binoculars methodically covering approach vectors with the patience of someone who understood that waiting was as much a weapon as movement. Morrison watched the Korean tracker through gaps in vegetation, saw the man's face show concentration and something else. Frustration, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt. Park had predicted their destination correctly, but had apparently underestimated how long they might take to arrive, or perhaps he was starting to question whether his prediction had been wrong. The death walk took them 3 hours to cover 200 meters, and by the time they'd passed Park's position and descended the ridge's far side, Morrison's legs were shaking with exhaustion that went beyond physical into something almost spiritual. They'd moved through enemy observation like water seeping through stone, and the impossibility of what they'd accomplished left him feeling disconnected from normal reality. Only when they were half a kilometer clear did Albert allow them to resume normal movement, and even then they maintained the counter-tracking protocols that had become second nature, reverse-stepping periodically, using rocks and logs, creating a trail so ambiguous that even if Park eventually searched this area, he'd find nothing conclusive. They reached Australian lines at WWII just after midnight on the 9th day, challenged by sentries who nearly shot them before recognizing Morrison's whispered password. Captain Harriott was waiting at the forward command post, his face showing relief that he tried unsuccessfully to hide behind professional composure. Wright's team reported you were split off as decoy, Harriott said after the debriefing began. Intelligence estimated your survival chances at less than 20%. Morrison looked at Albert, who was sitting quietly in the corner cleaning mud from his feet with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. We had good instructions, sir, Morrison said. The intelligence they'd gathered led to successful operations against the Japanese positions at Mubo. The techniques Albert and David had taught became the foundation for what was eventually formalised as the Countertracker Protocol, training hundreds of soldiers in methods that originated in Australian desert country and Korean mountains, adapted to New Guinea jungle through the strange alchemy of war. Park continued tracking Allied patrols until the Japanese withdrawal from the region in late 1944. According to captured documents found years later, he'd written reports describing Australian scouts who could walk like spirits, leaving trails that lied. He never learned their names or understood that the techniques confounding him came from knowledge systems older than written history, transmitted through demonstration and practice rather than manuals and classroom instruction. Morrison survived the war, returned to Perth, and sometimes taught his children to walk quietly through the bush, using principles he'd learned in those desperate days learning to become impossible. He never forgot the sight of Albert moving through the jungle like he'd grown from it, or the feeling of passing invisible through enemy positions while Park searched for ghosts. Albert and David returned to Central Australia after discharge, their contributions to Allied intelligence operations filed away in archives that few would ever read. The knowledge they'd shared didn't die with them, but continued in the oldest way humans have preserved wisdom, through teaching, through demonstration, through the transmission of understanding from those who know to those who need to learn. The ground remembers everything, Albert had said. The question is whether you're listening to what it's trying to tell you. Subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. If this story resonated with you, leave your thoughts below and share this piece of forgotten history with others who appreciate the hidden narratives of war.